This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. In Kaidan, we invite you to step into a world where the ordinary meets the profoundly unsettling. Prepare for a collection of personal accounts that blur the lines of reality. From peculiar family traditions and mysterious childhood words to hidden supernatural battles. These are not just ghost stories, but tales of the strange, the unexplained, and the subtly terrifying that linger long after they're told. I'm going to tell you about a terrifying event I experienced when I was little. At the time, I was in elementary school, living with my younger sister, Daisy, my older sister, Rose, and my mom in a small, typical apartment. Every night, we'd all pile into the living room, our sleeping bags and pillows lined up side by side on the floor. One night, Mom wasn't feeling well, so she asked me to turn off all the lights. I switched off the lights in the bathroom and the living room, turned off the TV, then went back to the living room where we slept, told Mom all the lights in the house were off, and slipped into my sleeping bag. Daisy was already asleep beside me. It was much earlier than our usual bedtime, so I couldn't fall asleep right away. I just lay there, staring blankly at the ceiling for a while. Then, suddenly, a strange clank clank sound echoed through the silent room. I bolted upright from my sleeping bag and looked around the dark room. But there was nothing there. A moment later, I heard the same sound again. It seemed to be coming from the living room. Rose, who was next to me, whispered, "Did you hear that?" So it wasn't just my imagination. I looked around the room again, but Daisy and Mom were just sleeping. There was nothing else in the room. Something was wrong. It definitely sounded metallic, and it was quite close. Rose seemed bothered by the sound too, and said she was going to check the living room. I followed her out of our sleeping area and into the pitch-black living room. From near the kitchen, we cautiously peered into the living room. That's when we saw it. The dining table in the middle of the living room. The one where we always ate our meals and did our homework. A person was sitting on top of that table. Their back was to us, so we couldn't see their face. But they had long hair reaching down to their waist, a slender build, and from the long flowing white gown they were wearing, we knew it was a woman. I shuddered and looked at Rose. Rose didn't notice my gaze at all. She was completely fixated on the woman. In the pitch-black living room, the woman sat perfectly upright in a formal kneeling position on the table, showing us only her back. This time, the sound clearly came from the woman. That's when I let out a gasp. I don't remember what I said, but I made a sound again. The woman then turned to face me. The moment I saw her face, I felt like I was going to lose my mind. In both of her eyes, iron nails were driven in, perfectly fitting the size of her eyeballs. Looking closer, she was holding something like a heavy club in both hands. And with a smile that only involved her mouth, she said, "Your family is finished." The next day, I woke up in my own bed, in my own room. After a moment, I remembered what had happened yesterday and asked Mom if she had carried me from the living room to my room, but she just looked confused. I asked Daisy, and she reacted the same way, just laughing and saying, "You were probably just dreaming." What's more, she even claimed she was fast asleep the whole time. That couldn't be right. I definitely saw that in the living room and passed out there. Someone must have found me collapsed in the living room and carried me to my bed. But when I tried to recall it again, my mind felt foggy. Only her terrifying expression and the words that came from her sneering mouth were crystal clear in my memory. My family and I were finished. The strange events started that very day. It was in the evening when I came home from school and opened the front door. Usually, Mom would be in the living room or cooking dinner in the kitchen, but the living room was completely dark. All the lights were off. "Mom, where are you?" I called out from the doorway. But the house was eerily silent, as if no one was home. The door was unlocked. Did she forget to lock it and go shopping? Mom could be a bit scatterbrained, so I sighed, thinking this sometimes happened. As I took off my shoes and was about to step inside, at that very moment I heard a sound from the living room. All the blood in my veins seemed to freeze instantly. It was that same sound, exactly like the one from a few years ago, and just like yesterday. No, I couldn't stay here any longer. My instinct for terror completely overwhelmed my reason. I yanked the door open and blindly scrambled down the apartment stairs. What on earth was happening? Where was Mom and Daisy? I tried to think about my family, to somehow forget that sound. If I kept thinking about that, I felt like I would go insane. I ran and ran down the darkening street until I reached a nearby supermarket. Mom must be shopping here, I muttered to myself, catching my breath as I went inside. Given the time of day, there weren't many people in the store. There were a few kids who looked about my age, maybe middle schoolers, and some women who seemed like moms picking up ingredients for dinner. Seeing that perfectly normal scene, I felt a little calmer, and I started to think about what had just happened at home. The pitch-black living room, the unlocked door, and that metallic sound. There shouldn't have been anyone in the house, no one except that. The strange silence of the house when I called for Mom from the doorway. No one could have been there in that state. But if someone was there, I only went as far as the entryway, so I hadn't really looked inside. Maybe the lights were just off. Maybe Mom was sleeping in another room and just didn't hear me. I desperately wanted to confirm. So I decided to call home. There was a payphone next to the supermarket. I put in the coins and carefully dialed the number with trembling fingers. The hand holding the receiver wouldn't stop shaking. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. The ringing echoed deep in my head. Click. Someone picked up the phone. I held my breath. An unbearable moment. Hello? Hello? It was Mom's voice. Hearing her calm voice, I felt a little relieved. Hello, Mom? Oh, what's wrong? You're quite late today, aren't you? Did something happen? My hands started trembling again. Not just my hands, my legs were shaking so much I could barely stand. This was too strange. Even in my panicked state, I recognized this abnormality. Why, Mom? What do you mean, why? Are you all right? What's really going on? Mom shouldn't have been able to answer the phone right now. Our house only had a phone in the living room. Earlier, it wasn't Mom in the living room, but asterisk, that monster. So how could this person be answering the phone so calmly? And her saying, "You're quite late today," as if she'd been home the whole time. The person casually talking to me on the other end of the line felt like nothing more than an unknown entity. And from my parched throat, I managed to squeeze out these words. "Who are you?" Huh? Who? After a brief pause, I heard the reply. Your mother. Chapter 2. The Living Room Gathering. The Family Who Gazed at the Painting. This is the story of my ex-girlfriend, Sarah, and her parents. I had been dating Sarah for about a year. We met on a dating app. She was 28 at the time, and I vaguely thought we'd have to decide whether to get married before she turned 30. That's when she brought up, "Why don't you come over to my parents' place for dinner sometime?" We both lived alone in New Jersey, and her parents' house was also in New Jersey. She had moved out because her parents' place was too far from her job in New York City. Her apartment was about an hour away from her parents' house. I briefly panicked, wondering if this was a fast track to a proposal. But she quickly said, "Oh no, nothing like that. I just want to introduce you." The atmosphere wasn't heavy, so I took her at her word and agreed. Still, meeting a girlfriend's parents for the first time is always nerve-wracking. I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. I went to her parents' house on a Sunday evening. Sarah had already told her family about me, and we were scheduled to have a potluck dinner that night. Of course, staying overnight was too big a step, so I planned to leave after dinner, using work the next day as an excuse. That's why we deliberately set it for Sunday, not Friday or Saturday. Her parents' house was a typical suburban home, about a 20-minute drive from the train station. When I arrived, her parents greeted me at the door. They were both in their 50s and seemed very kind, welcoming me warmly. Sarah was an only child, so it was just her parents living there now. After a bit of small talk, dinner was served. It was a fantastic barbecue, and I could tell they'd gone all out. It felt like they were really trying to welcome me, which I appreciated. But from that moment on, I started noticing something odd about the house, and I found it hard to focus on dinner. We were eating in the kitchen diner, and from there I could see into the adjacent living room. There was no TV. Instead, a large painting hung exactly where a television would normally be. I won't go into too much detail about the painting, but it had a creepy, melancholic atmosphere, like something by Zdzislaw Beksinski, depicting a woman staring straight out. The woman in the painting wasn't grotesque in a bloody way, but looking at it made me feel as if my heart was being steeped in darkness. Spooked by the painting, I initially tried to avoid it, focusing instead on listening to Sarah's childhood stories. But eventually, the conversation drifted, and I couldn't help but say, "That's quite a painting, isn't it?" Sarah's mother smiled and began to explain. "We actually stumbled upon this painting while we were on our honeymoon in France," she said. Of course, we didn't go there planning to buy a painting, but we just fell in love with it at first sight. The price of the painting itself wasn't an issue, but getting it shipped back to the States was quite a hassle. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should ask why a painting, not a TV, proudly occupied the living room. But I decided it was their family's custom and kept quiet. Then, after we finished dinner, something strange happened. Sarah's father was the first to get up from the table. "Make yourselves at home," he said. and walked straight into the living room, where he slowly sat down and began to gaze at the painting. I mumbled, "Thanks for dinner," and Sarah also got up, put her dishes in the sink, then sat down next to her father. In other words, she too began to gaze at the painting with him. I couldn't understand what they were doing. They just sat there, staring at the painting, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, like watching TV. I'm not sure if words alone can convey the strangeness of it, but the two of them silently staring at the painting didn't seem like the same people who had just been sharing a meal with me. I had tried to accept the lack of a TV and the presence of the painting as part of their family's unique culture. But the act of sitting down to stare at a painting they'd owned for years right after dinner was so far removed from anything I considered normal. "Honey," Sarah's mother said, "why don't you finish up with the dishes, and then we can relax in the living room? I'll take care of the rest." While I was still trying to process what was happening, Sarah's mother started clearing the dinner table. My mind was still reeling, but I had no choice, so I somewhat dazedly made my way to the living room. I quietly sat down behind Sarah and her father. They just sat there, saying nothing, just staring at the painting. I tried to look at the painting too, but between its inherent creepiness and the unsettling strangeness of the situation, I couldn't meet its gaze. I was trembling. After a while, Sarah's mother came into the living room with tea, handed it out to everyone, and sat down next to me. And so everyone in the house sat there, gazing at the painting. Just gazing at the painting. Occasionally, Sarah's father would ask her about her recent work or inquire about me. Sometimes there would even be laughter. As we all sat there staring at the painting, I realized this was probably a perfectly normal scene in her parents' home. Because it was so normal for them to gaze at the painting, no one felt the need to explain it. I desperately tried to ignore it, forcing myself to pretend that what was in front of me was a television. After about an hour in the living room, I said, "It's getting late. I should head home." And Sarah and I left the house. Her parents gave us warm goodbyes, just as they had welcomed me, telling us to come back any time. Not long after that, I broke up with Sarah. I told her I wanted to focus on my career and needed some space. But that was just an excuse. I never told her the real reason. I don't know who was right. I simply didn't have the capacity to accept that culture. I pride myself on respecting others' ways of life, and I don't want to judge, but it just felt fundamentally wrong to me. Then again, maybe my feeling that it was abnormal was what was abnormal, and it was perfectly normal for them. Regardless of who was abnormal, I didn't have the courage to accept that reality. So I just let things fade away. That experience left me unsure of what was right and what was wrong, eroding my ability to make sound judgments. It started affecting my work, too. I've since quit my job and moved back in with my parents in Chicago, occasionally picking up odd jobs to get by. I came back because I feel relatively calmer in the familiar comfort of my childhood home. Maybe nothing strange actually happened. Maybe no one was abnormal, and I just misunderstood something. But it was enough to break something inside me. I don't think I can ever truly accept people again. Everyone else seems to interact with others so naturally, as if it's the easiest thing in the world. How do they do it? How can they assume others think just like them? Or, even if they don't, that the differences will be minor? I just can't comprehend it. Don't they ever worry that someone with completely unacceptable ideas might be laughing right next to them? I can't bear that thought. The hand-knitted sweater, a cursed gift. This is something I experienced recently. I'd been meaning to tell someone, but I've been feeling so muddled and uneasy about it, so I'll just write it down here. Since around the end of last year, I've been getting these sudden dizzy spells and bouts of nausea. At first, I thought I was just catching a bug, but it wasn't like a normal illness. I'd be perfectly fine, then suddenly feel terrible, only for it to pass after a short while, and then it would happen all over again. I went to the doctor, but they couldn't find a cause, just telling me it was probably stress and giving me some medication. But it didn't help at all. This went on for over a month, until just the other day. I had an errand at a neighbor's house, and there happened to be another visitor leaving, so I exchanged a brief greeting with them at the doorstep. It was a refined-looking woman in her 50s, and her expression suddenly changed. She apologized, saying, "I'm so sorry to ask you this out of the blue, but is that sweater you're wearing hand-knitted, and was it a recent gift?" I froze, completely taken aback. But it was, in fact, a sweater a friend I'd known since middle school had sent me before Christmas. My friend is a pro at knitting. She makes it a hobby to knit and send sweaters and accessories to family and friends. When I confirmed it, the woman then described my friend's appearance in such detail, saying, "Your friend, she's like this, isn't she?" It was so spot on, I actually wondered if she knew my friend personally. She was what you'd call an intuitive person. Wow, I thought, so there really are people with such abilities in the world. I was simply fascinated. But then, the words she spoke next gave me a severe shock. Normally, I try not to talk about intuitive matters with anyone but close friends, because people would think I'm strange, wouldn't they? But I just couldn't pretend not to see what was happening with you. And I know saying this might upset you, but to me, I hear the words, "May you be miserable," being spewed out from every single stitch of that sweater. That's what she said. Naturally, I was horrified, because my friend and I had been close for many years, and besides, she's not the kind of person who would ever think such a thing, let alone say it. But when I really thought back, my health would always worsen when I was wearing that sweater, or a scarf I'd received from her a little before that. And so, just to be safe, I followed her advice. When I got rid of the sweater and scarf, my condition actually improved. Even if I couldn't take that woman's words at face value, if it were true, did that mean the person I thought was my best friend had been knitting that sweater, putting resentment into every single stitch? I have absolutely no idea why she would resent me. But according to her, my friend herself might not even be aware of her own feelings. She said, "You see, deep-seated feelings can transfer into handmade items. We'll always be together." This is a story my friend Tammy experienced last summer vacation. With those words, I said goodbye to my friend. It was almost 6, but the sky was still bright. No way we could play this late in winter. Tomorrow, I'm going to a haunted place with my friend Katie. Katie's mom is going to drop us off at a nearby parking lot, so no worries. I'm home. Tonight's dinner is, yay, hamburger steaks. Tammy, dinner will be ready soon, so please wipe the table. Okay, Mom. Can I go out with my friend Katie tomorrow? Sure, but... Yes! I did a silent fist pump. That night, I had a strange dream. A girl in a floral dress was standing in front of me, looking down. Just as I was about to speak, the girl looked up, and with a bloody face, she said, "Forever together." I woke up then. I woke up to find it was already morning. Ignoring the dream, I decided to go with Katie. The haunted place was an old, abandoned tunnel. Apparently, a girl was hit by a car here a long time ago. Hey, Tammy, you're going to take pictures, right? Then let's include this doll in the shot. What Katie was holding was a tattered girl doll. Yeah, cool. Let's take it quickly. Click. The moment the camera shutter clicked loudly, Katie suddenly vanished. And when I looked to my side, that doll was glaring at me. As I tried to move away, something heavy pressed down on me, and a voice whispered in my ear, "Goodbye. You'll always be with me." Chapter 5. The Snow Shelter. A Voice from the Mountain. Mark said he stopped mountaineering because of a certain incident. In high school, Mark was invited by a friend to join the mountaineering club and became captivated by the mountains. Being big and physically strong back then, he often undertook quite reckless climbs. He'd even carried injured teammates down the mountain on his back, making him a reliable presence among his peers. One year, Mark decided to climb a local mountain by himself. It was a 5-hour round-trip day hike, but that particular year saw heavy snowfall, leading to many reports of lost hikers. His club advisor had repeatedly warned him that solo winter climbing was dangerous. But young Mark couldn't resist a challenge when told it was risky. The winter climb began with a light snow falling from the morning. It seemed several groups had already ascended, as Mark started his climb by following their footprints in the snow. It wasn't his first time in a snowy mountain, but the snow, which reached below his knees, was certainly difficult to walk through. The sky was covered by thick gray clouds, and there was no sign of the snow letting up. The visibility rapidly turned white, and though there was no wind, the snowfall intensified. The snow was accumulating so quickly that he could no longer discern the path he had just taken. The tracks of the previous climbers were also fading. Although he had climbed this mountain several times, its difficulty had increased that day. To Mark, it felt like an exciting challenge. The mountaineering club had a winter training camp coming up after the new year, and he wanted to gain even a little more experience than his friends. He climbed frantically, digging his ice axe into the almost vertical slope. As he passed what could be considered the most challenging part of the mountain, he heard a man's voice call out, "Hello!" Mark stopped and looked around. However, he couldn't locate the source of the voice. So focused on the climb, he hadn't realized how much the visibility had worsened. "Hello! Over here! Is anyone there?" From the tone of the voice, Mark wondered if it might be a lost hiker. The snow briefly paused, and Mark pinpointed the direction of the voice, heading towards it. "Excuse me, is anyone there? Are you okay?" Mark called out in response. As he moved towards the voice, the snow stopped and visibility improved. He was off the main trail, but Mark continued walking regardless. The person might be in mortal danger after all. After walking for a while, he saw a hole in the slope ahead of him. A trekking pole was stuck into the snow next to the hole, and he realized this was a snow shelter someone had dug. A snow shelter is a hole dug into the snow ground or slope for emergency shelter in a snowy mountain. "Hey, over here! Help!" The voice clearly came from inside the snow shelter. "Are you okay?" Mark quickly peered into the hole. There was enough space for one person to lie down. Inside the dim hole, a lantern with its light out, a tattered sleeping bag, and a backpack lay scattered. No matter how much he looked around, there was no one there. "I'm here. Who?" "No one is here." It came from inside the sleeping bag. A sudden chill ran down his spine, and he immediately backed away from the snow shelter. As Mark tried to return to the trail, he heard the voice again. "Hello?" The snow began to fall heavily once more. Mark descended the mountain. The voice continued to call out periodically, as if trying to lure him. Towards the end, with almost no visibility due to the snow, he practically tumbled down the mountain. That day, seeing the tattered sleeping bag and backpack inside the snow shelter, Mark felt his burning passion for climbing instantly extinguished. He had a premonition that he might one day disappear, just like that, leaving his gear behind for someone else to find. After graduating high school and leaving the club, he never climbed a mountain again. Chapter 6. Torashi, a mysterious childhood word. About 20 years ago, when I was 23, I lived in an apartment building with my parents. One quiet, ordinary afternoon, my mother and I were home. She was either doing chores or relaxing in the living room. Anyway, as my mother was going about her usual routine, I, who had been playing in another room, suddenly came running down the hallway in a panic. "That's right. Mom, Torashi is here!" I cried, clinging to my mother, terrified. Confused by my incomprehensible state, my mother asked what was suddenly wrong. "Torashi is here! Torashi is here!" I kept repeating, pointing towards the front door at the end of the hallway, trying to hide behind her. My startled mother asked, "What's a Torashi? Is it like a tiger? What does it look like?" "No," I insisted. "It was Torashi. It's here, it's here," I kept saying, as if something was approaching right then and there. I just desperately clung to my mother's back. Presumably, my frantic state gradually subsided. After somehow calming me down, she tried to ask about this mysterious word, Torashi, but its true nature remained a complete mystery. "It wasn't a tiger or a cow," I said, "but Torashi that had come. I don't clearly remember it myself, only the memory of being terrified by it at the front door. But this Torashi apparently came often after that.
For a while, whether I was at home or in the car, I would suddenly cry out, "Torashi!" and become frightened.
As I grew older, the Torashi phenomenon eventually subsided, as if nothing had ever happened. It became a well-known family anecdote. Remember that time when this crazy thing happened kind of story. I myself just figured it was a typical childhood fear, given my love for imagination and fantasy. Since I grew up hearing the story so often, I never really found it scary. Torashi simply existed as a word, a concept, a story unique to our family. Then, just the other day, my friends and I were swapping scary stories, and when they asked if I had anything, I shared this one, explaining it wasn't exactly scary, but definitely strange. Everyone was intrigued. That's weird, they all agreed. Then a friend suggested, "Why don't you Google it?" That thought had never crossed my mind, so I immediately searched for it. It turned out there was a Torashi, but it seemed to be the name of an herb native to Southeast Asia, with no particular relevant meaning. We joked that maybe it was symbolic in some herbal, mystical way. And as we scrolled down the page, we found one entry with a completely different meaning. It was a dialect word from a remote island off the coast of Hawaii, meaning "kill them." My state of mind at that moment was indescribable. More than fear, it was a sensation of utter shock and astonishment that washed over my entire body with incredible intensity. You see, my father's side of the family is from Hawaii. So you could say I'm half Hawaiian, but neither I nor my father's generation had ever really been to Hawaii. We'd all grown up in the Midwest, a fake half Hawaiian, you might say. And as for the Miyako dialect, I'd never heard a single word of it. My father, of course, had never heard of Torashi either. Apparently, "kill them" is more of a rough, "I'll get you" kind of aggressive phrase rather than a curse, but I had absolutely no memory of it. It seems my childhood self was uttering a Miyako dialect word that no one, including my father and me, should have known. It feels incredibly strange. To call it a dormant, subconscious memory in my blood might be an exaggeration, but it makes me feel like there's something profound about bloodlines, about the deep roots connecting us to our ancestral lands, the land of indigenous peoples, of the Pacific, and specifically of Hawaii, a heritage that runs deep through generations. I'd love to live in Hawaii someday. I wonder if I'd feel something there. It might just be a coincidence, but it was certainly a strange experience. Chapter 7. The Great Supernatural War. A Government Agent's Fight. Greetings, everyone. I'm sure you're all familiar with supernatural entities, whether from tales of ghosts and goblins, or the creatures in popular shows like Supernatural or Stranger Things. But do you believe they're real? Let me be clear, they are real. While their presence might not be as overt in your daily lives anymore, these beings absolutely exist. I can't prove it. No, I can't offer you irrefutable evidence. But this time, I wanted to share my own experiences and shed light on the hidden war against these entities that's being fought behind the scenes all around the world. First, a brief introduction. To protect my identity, I'll have to be a bit vague, so please bear with me. I currently work for the government. From an outsider's perspective, it's a perfectly ordinary department. However, what I actually do, simply put, is deal with supernatural entities. My family has for generations been a line of specialists in managing these supernatural occurrences. Now, I've only heard the stories, so I can't vouch for every detail, but apparently we were quite the formidable and righteous family, dedicated to this work. Because of this lineage, I grew up learning the ropes of dealing with these entities from a very young age. Incidentally, I can't see them now, nor do I remember it, but my mother claims I could see these beings when I was a child. Despite the term supernatural management, we don't just go around fighting and destroying these entities willy-nilly. Most of the time, it involves negotiation, asking them to relocate. You might be thinking, how do you negotiate with a supernatural being? It might be an overstatement to say it's surprisingly easy, but it is, in fact, straightforward. There are various established protocols. How to summon them, how to appease them, how to send them away. We simply follow these rules. I can't disclose the actual methods, so let me give you a hypothetical example. We interview the client, identify the likely type of entity, and then prepare something it might favor. We then summon the entity and present our request. That's generally how it works. Most of these entities aren't inherently malicious. Often, they inadvertently cause trouble for humans. So, we don't just go around destroying them indiscriminately. I've only ever had to eliminate one in the past, and it left a bitter taste. It was also incredibly dangerous. I can't see these entities with my own eyes, but like the radio waves from a TV remote, they exist even if unseen. So, even if the method seems simple, it's a life or death situation every single time. And yes, the rituals do involve things you might imagine, like ropes and candles. They're not just for show, they're genuinely necessary. Here's one memorable encounter I wanted to share. It happened to me, but it's a story my parents told me. When I was in kindergarten, I was what you'd call a picked-on kid. Because I was often picked on and had no friends, I always played on a particular hill near our house. Because that hill was where my only friend was. I can't recall it at all now, but apparently we played together every day until dusk. It was a rural area and right outside our door, so my parents never really worried. But one day my parents told me, "A lot of cars have started using that road lately, so you can't go to that hill anymore." Yes, I apparently just said okay at the time, but the very next day I went back to the hill. There, I reportedly stumbled upon my parents performing a ritual. Whether I knew it instinctively or not, I apparently started crying and tried to stop them with all my might. Yes, that friend was one of them. Later, I learned that people had been experiencing strange incidents on that hill, being suddenly called out to, turning around, and then tripping for no apparent reason. My friend was apparently the cause. So, while some entities can be harmless or even endearing like that, others are truly fearsome. They can be harnessed by people to cast curses, or they can directly inflict harm. Furthermore, in recent years, a very serious issue has emerged within our community. It's the phenomenon of deities across our nation losing their power. You might be thinking, what on earth? But this is an extremely grave issue, and it's closely intertwined with the entities we deal with. By our definition, these entities and what you might call deities have a very close relationship. One can become the other. Simply put, if they are revered and elevated, they can gain immense power and become godlike beings. But consider this. In recent years, our nation can hardly be described as one with strong faith, can it? Churches are emptying. The number of people actively practicing and passing on their faith is dwindling, and most people dismiss anything supernatural as mere superstition, don't they? As a result, the power of established deities in our country is diminishing year by year. What happens then? The entities proliferate, inevitably bringing misfortune and disaster upon our nation. This has become a critical issue within our field. Incidentally, on a global scale, the management of these entities and the use of them for curses are actively practiced, especially in places like China and India. The advancements are astounding. You might find it hard to believe, but rituals are now being conducted with the aid of computers. They reportedly calculate all appearance and phenomenon patterns, conducting daily experiments. Honestly, I was so astonished, I almost blurted out, "Are you serious?" Of course, none of this ever makes it into the public eye, but they are fighting every day to protect their nations. It's not impossible that our nation, too, could face a full-blown war with this potentially growing industry in the future.
This is a completely outlandish tale, and I expect most of you won't believe a word of it. But before I conclude, I wanted to share one simple thing you can all do. Go visit your ancestors' graves. Just pay your respects to the ancestors who shaped who you are, the founders of our nation, and those who fought for its freedom. It's a fundamental act, isn't it? Just go to express gratitude. If everyone simply does this, our nation will grow stronger.
We've journeyed through tales of unsettling family customs, cursed gifts, ghostly encounters, and the whispers of unseen forces. From a painting that eroded a relationship, to a childhood word echoing ancestral secrets, these stories remind us that reality is often stranger and more fragile than we imagine. They challenge our perceptions of normal, hinting at a world where hidden resentments can manifest and ancient powers wane with our faith. Perhaps the greatest horror lies not in the grotesque, but in the subtle ways the inexplicable can unravel our sanity. Thank you for listening.